Welcome to this Transforming Worship simple guide to planning and leading worship. I'm Helen Bent, and in these 3 videos, I want to equip you with appropriate tools to prepare and lead worship, which will inspire and enrich your congregations and enable them to meet with God. Worship is at the heart of what we do as Christians. We're designed to worship now and on into eternity. Worship enriches, it shapes our beliefs, our actions, our way of life. And through worship, God transforms us as individuals, congregations and communities. But when it comes to preparing and leading worship, we don't always get a lot of training. Most of the time, we learn on the job. This resource is aimed at lay people who find themselves called upon to lead worship. In this first session, we'll be setting the scene and thinking about the essence of worship. What is worship? Why do we do it? Who is worship for? And what should it be like? In session 2, we'll be getting down to the nitty-gritty of planning, looking at our Anglican heritage and how we use common worship resources most effectively to provide meaningful worship in our local context. Session 3 will then move on to look at aspects of leadership. What does the task of leadership involve? What skills are required? How do we build up rapport with the congregation? How do we ensure we communicate clearly? The sessions will all follow the same pattern. There will be a little input and then a chance to pause and think about what you have heard with some questions to guide you. Overall, I want to build your confidence in God, your confidence in the liturgy, and your confidence in your calling as leaders of worship in your context. What is worship? Some of the oldest archaeological evidence suggests that in every generation, in different places and different ways, people have worshipped. Our church buildings remind us of the rich legacy of worship that has been handed down from one generation to another. Anyone can worship. We all have spiritual moments. Those moments when we are stopped in our tracks by the beauty of creation or a life-changing event. We have an experience of the numinous, the spiritual realm which seems to point to something beyond ourselves. It might be an awesome view, lofty snow-topped mountains, or a perfect reflection in a lake. A moment when we are overwhelmed by the beauty and grandeur of nature, perhaps glimpsing God the Creator for the first time. Or it might be the birth of a baby, when we marvel at the intricacy of tiny fingers and toes, and our natural response is one of thanks for the miracle of a new life brought safely into the world. Worship is a kind of shorthand for what we do in church when we meet together, but it can mean different things to different people. Here are a few ideas to get us started. Worship literally means worthship, from the Old English, wero skipe, wero meaning worthy, skipe meaning state, and it's usually associated with giving reverence to a deity, giving God reverence, love, honour and respect because God is worthy of it. Worship is a gift, inspired by God and offered to God. It's vitally important that the activity we call public worship is truly God-centred and not merely a gathering of like-minded who share certain tastes in liturgy and music. Worship is central to our faith. Moses reminded the Israelites, we are called to love the Lord our God with all our heart, with all our soul, and with all our strength. It's a command, an imperative. This is a life skill we are to pass on to our children and those around us. And it's not just for an hour on a Sunday. It demands our best in time and energy. Worship involves the whole of life, 24/7. We inhabit worship on a daily basis. In Romans 12, St. Paul tells us to offer ourselves as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God, which is our spiritual act of worship. Worship is worked out practically in the way we live. A process of transformation is underway so that we are not simply shaped by worldly patterns and values. Worship encourages us to behave in a more godly manner and become more Christ-like. Worship is not fundamentally about texts and music, but a transforming encounter with the living God. Moses met with God unexpectedly out in the desert when he saw a burning bush that was not consumed. God spoke to him out of the bush, telling him to take off his shoes because he was standing on holy ground. Taking off his shoes was an act of reverence, conveying respect and sincerity. Worship has a social aspect. Moses was alone when he met with God, and many of us will experience meaningful times of worship on our own with God. However, worship is also a corporate activity, where we come together as the people of God. Although we are all individuals, we belong to a bigger group. We are the body of Christ. By one Spirit we were baptized into one body. These or similar words are used at the sharing of the peace. When we worship together, we encourage and strengthen the faith of one another, and then we frequently socialise further over refreshments at the end of a service. Ideally, we need both personal and corporate worship to nourish and sustain our daily spiritual life and the life of the Church. Worship then prepares us for mission. At the end of a service, we often say, "Go in peace to love and serve the Lord." During worship in church, we equip people to go out into the world to continue their life of worship 24/7, sharing the good news in their community. It's important to make real connections with people's everyday life at home, school, or work, and to empower them to continue their life of worship when they leave church. Now it's over to you. It's time to pause the video and think about the following questions. What does worship mean to you? Think of an act of worship that particularly moved you. Why did this happen? What do you find helpful or unhelpful in worship? Let's move on to why worship. When we talk about worship, the Westminster Shorter Catechism is often quoted. This states that our chief end is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. But what does that actually mean? We can glorify God in many ways, through music, art, language, even our work, as individuals and together as a group. We've already said that worship is about God first, but it is also designed to be an enjoyable experience for the participants, enriching, sustaining and life-giving to the people of God. It can be formal or informal, ranging from a structured service in church to a simple gathering where 2 or 3 come together. If we compare this with the canons of the Church of England, Canon B 1.2 puts it a slightly different way. Worship offered should glorify God and edify the people. Worship should glorify God first and foremost, but it should also be uplifting and meaningful for the congregation, sending them out from a service in a better frame of mind than when they came in. It's all about relationship. Relationships are made up of conversation. When we worship, we enter into a dynamic dialogue which is different every time when we meet, even with the same group of people using the same words. Time has moved on and we're in a new place. We worship in 3 dimensions. First of all, the vertical. God reaches down to earth from heaven, revealing himself to us in different ways, and we respond by speaking to him. This is a 2-way dialogue. It involves both a personal and a corporate response through Bible reading, prayer, and song. The horizontal dimension is between us and others in the congregation. We stand together in solidarity, expressing our worship to God in the presence of one another. Even when we worship on our own at home, we know that many others are also worshipping, perhaps using the same form, whether it be morning prayer from a book or prayer for the day on an app on a phone. This builds up our faith and strengthens our relationship with one another. However, worship should not be introspective, but outward-looking, in order that others can be drawn in. This outward dimension proclaims the gospel and the truths about God to those on the fringes of the church and those out in the wider community. We might ask ourselves, how do we encourage encounter and make Christ real? But only God himself can do that. Liturgy is a word we quickly come across when discussing worship. It comes from Greek liturgia, derived from 2 words, laos meaning people and ergon meaning work, literally the work of the people. Coming from a Greco-Roman period, this originally referred to civil work. This was a world of straight roads to aid commerce and impressive aqueducts to ensure adequate water supplies for everyone. This was work done by the people for the mutual benefit of the people. In Christian use, liturgy refers to the official public services of the Church, and when used in the context of the Church of England, it refers to the whole collection of authorised services, rites, prayers and sacraments that we use in public worship. We might think of it as the sacred work which God's people do together. Given that liturgy is the work of the whole congregation, it makes sense for lay people to be involved as much as possible in a service of worship, including leading, reading, praying. It's great to hear different voices. It's time to press pause again. Here are some more questions to think about. What is worship like in your own church? How does the liturgy, or the work of the people, happen in practice? Who is worship for? It might seem rather obvious, but it still needs saying. Worship is for God first, and it needs to retain a clear God focus throughout. Some contemporary worship songs shift the focus subtly so that they become more me-centred rather than God-centred. We need to keep a watchful eye for that subtle change of emphasis. Worship is also for a local gathered group of people. Some will have been part of both village and church all their lives. They may therefore have little experience of worship anywhere else. Some people will come regularly and some will come on high days and holidays. A typical rural congregation will often have a family feel in which everyone knows everyone else. A typical rural congregation is often diverse, from mixed backgrounds of denomination, tradition and style. They could be Anglican, but they could just as easily have grown up in Roman Catholic, Methodist, Baptist or Pentecostal churches. Living in a village, they all now come to the local church. Therefore, in our services, we need to be sensitive in our approach and inspire everyone to worship with confidence. These factors will all need to be taken into account if worship is going to honour God and genuinely meet the needs of our local community. What should worship be like? Why not pause the video for a moment or two to think how you would answer this question before I give you some suggestions. Worship should be inspiring, joyful and uplifting, a worthwhile use of our time which draws us back again and again. Worship should be user-friendly, welcoming and inviting, inclusive of everyone of any age, background or ethnicity, including the physical access to the building. Worship should be engaging. Involvement encourages ownership, so it is important to ensure that everyone actively participates in the service. Worship should be rich. It doesn't have to be long. Services can be short and simple, but they need rich content to feed and sustain us. Worship is formative. The words we say and sing and hear together, with the gestures and symbolic actions, shape our faith and inform our beliefs. Worship is also embodied. It needs people. Worship happens within the praise and prayer of God's people gathered at any given time. In order to fulfill all of these aspirations, worship will use symbols of word and sacrament focused around the lectern, pulpit, font and communion table. Other symbols may be present, particularly at different seasons, drawing our attention to the crib at Christmas or the cross during Holy Week. Rhythm and repetition ensure that the words of the liturgy become familiar and can be committed to memory. These will then shape and sustain faith throughout life, even when church attendance is no longer possible. We will be aware of visible ritual. We are all creatures of habit with familiar routines. Members of the congregation frequently sit in the same place week by week. Services begin and end in a particular manner, reinforced by where the leader stands. Some use the sign of the cross at various points in the service, others don't. Some kneel to take communion, others stand. There is also invisible ritual, which is implicit within each individual worshipper. This is more nuanced, but can show itself in attentiveness and prayerfulness, but also in distraction and restlessness. A service includes movement and action. Parts of the service will happen in specific places, with lessons read at the lectern, sermons from the pulpit or chancel steps, and communion in the sanctuary. Then there is ministry to one another, through praying together, sharing the peace, and sharing refreshments before or after the service. Everyone is journeying together with a sense of direction and flow, and no matter where we worship, there will be a recognisable pattern and content. It's important to recognise that no one size fits all, so we must know our own context. Many churches and parishes are grouped into multi-benefices or mission partnerships, especially in rural areas. We value each church and village and their distinctiveness while working together across the group. The challenge is to create a unified identity while retaining the individual strengths of each church. It might suit a small congregation better to gather in the more intimate space of the choir stalls than sit scattered through the nave of a large church. Much of the time, we may well be providing worship for small congregations in a big church. But at festivals, the church can be overflowing with occasional worshippers. Both need to be considered in our planning. It's worth considering how welcoming we are for visitors, especially if we would like them to come again. How well does the demographic of the congregation match the demographic of the local population? Are there particular age groups missing? If there's a mismatch here, we might want to consider how we might attract younger people into our worship. We've already talked about a family feel, and families are intergenerational. At family gatherings, we accommodate all the different generations. So in worship too, what we offer needs to be accessible and inclusive for all without dumbing down the content. Every church is unique. There will be similarities, but there will also be differences. We will need to consider authenticity within each local context. Although there may be a sense of belonging to the larger group, each church is nevertheless a significant worshipping community in its own right, ministering within its own community. What is appropriate in one church might not be simply transferable to another, even within the same group of churches. It's time to press pause again. Here's some more questions to think about. Who makes up your regular local congregation? What might appropriate and authentic worship look like in your context? When it comes to the practicalities of preparing and leading worship, we need a framework, a kind of scaffolding which enables us to build creatively. The liturgy can provide that framework, giving basic shape and form. Within the framework, we then have the essentials, which always need to be present. And then within the framework, we can create an imaginative design, shaped by the readings for the day, a specific theme, or the current season of the year. Unfortunately, we don't get a blueprint for worship in the Bible, but we do get plenty of hints as to what worship should include. Perhaps the most obvious ingredient is scripture reading. In Luke's Gospel, we find Jesus attending regular worship in the local synagogue in Nazareth, where he stood up to read the passage appointed for the day. In Acts, we find the early church worshipping in one another's homes, with teaching, fellowship, breaking of bread and prayer. The letters to the Ephesians and the Colossians both mention the singing of psalms, hymns and spiritual songs. There is a clear expectation here that a congregation will encourage one another by singing together. Jesus taught his disciples about prayers of penitence, and when they asked how they should pray, he gave them the Lord's Prayer as a model. The Bible also makes references to actions and gestures. Kneeling to pray, a posture we're in danger of forgetting in today's church. A holy kiss, which might equate to our sharing of the peace. And raising hands in prayer, perhaps more frequently associated with certain evangelical styles of worship, but actually enacted by every priest during the Eucharistic prayer across the traditions. Finally, a word about imaginative design. We've already seen the importance of deep structures. Together with a basic framework and certain essential ingredients, worship needs a clear sense of direction and purpose that will gather us, refresh us, and send us back out into the world at the end of the service to worship through our lives for the rest of the week. Ideally, worship needs a transparency, which enables us to see God rather than becoming distracted by the people taking part. At the same time, it must have creativity, which will inspire us and draw us back again and again. We might also want to consider what we are building for the future. Although routine and familiarity can be helpful, we don't want to fall into the cycle of same old every week. We want to lead people upwards, deeper into God. Outwards, with compassion for one another within the church and within the wider community and beyond. And forwards, so that there is a healthy, vibrant worshipping community present in our churches for many years to come. It's time now to pause for a final set of questions. What are the basic structures you use in regular worship? Try jotting down the framework from memory, including all the basic ingredients. What might create a more imaginative design? Thank you for taking part. You can find accompanying resources to this session online in easy downloadable form. There is an additional handout for session 1 and a further reading list for the whole course with useful books and websites to help with your planning and leading worship. In this session, I've given you an overview of worship. Please join me for session 2, which is all about patterns for worship. The next session goes into detail about how to practically prepare a service of the Word and what should be included. Then session 3 will provide some tips on how to lead the service with clarity and confidence. If you found the session useful, why not become a member of Transforming Worship? Visit our website, transformingworship.news, and follow the link for joining.